"Pack your things. You're done here," the boss said coldly, leaning back in his leather chair. His tone carried the arrogance of someone who thought their authority was untouchable. He didn't even look up as the black employee stood in front of his desk, holding back the frustration and hurt that burned in her chest. "I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "You're just not the right fit for this company," he said dismissively, smirking as he added, "You should have seen this coming." She stared at him, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and quiet resolve. "You'll regret this decision," she said softly, turning to leave without another word. What the boss didn't realize was that his world was about to be turned upside down. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and redemption. The hum of keyboards and quiet conversations filled the sleek corporate office. Rows of glass-walled offices lined the floor, each one a symbol of success in this highly competitive company. The environment was polished, professional, and cold. An unspoken hierarchy dictated the energy in the room. Employees moved quickly, heads down, careful not to disrupt the fragile balance of power. In one corner of the floor sat a small but meticulously organized office. Inside, a young black woman in her late 20s worked diligently, her focus unwavering. Her desk was neat, papers stacked precisely, a small framed photo of her family the only personal touch. She adjusted her blazer as she typed, her expression calm yet determined. Her nameplate on the desk read Project Manager, a title she had earned through years of hard work and dedication. Her work ethic was unmatched, her attention to detail impeccable. But none of that seemed to matter in an environment where subtle biases whispered louder than her achievements. Across the floor, the department head's office loomed like a fortress. The glass walls revealed a middle-aged man leaning back in a large leather chair, his desk cluttered with papers and awards that screamed of his success. He was the kind of boss who ran his department with an iron fist, priding himself on his ability to spot the right talent. His office was a reflection of his personality, intimidating, grandiose, and unwelcoming. The man glanced at his watch, his expression sour. He had built his reputation on being a straight shooter. But beneath that facade lay a deep arrogance. He believed he could judge anyone's worth within seconds, and his judgments were rarely kind. He valued control and dismissed those who didn't fit his narrow standards. Earlier that day, a minor issue with a project had arisen. A delay in an external vendor's delivery had set back a key presentation, and, though it was a situation beyond her control, the young woman had taken the lead in resolving it. She worked tirelessly, coordinating with the vendor and revising schedules to minimize the impact. By the time the presentation was delivered, the crisis had been averted. But as she sat at her desk, reviewing her notes, she noticed her boss approaching. His heavy footsteps carried a tension that made nearby employees sit up straighter, their gazes darting back to their screens. He stopped in her doorway, his arms crossed. "We need to talk," he said curtly, motioning for her to follow him to his office. Inside the boss's office, the atmosphere was stifling. The large desk between them seemed more like a barrier than a workspace. He leaned back in his chair, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you caused today?" he asked, his voice cold. She blinked, momentarily confused. "Trouble, sir?" The vendor issue was resolved, and the presentation went smoothly. He held up a hand to cut her off. "I don't want excuses," he snapped. "I want results. If you had managed the situation better, the delay wouldn't have happened in the first place." Her heart sank. She had expected acknowledgement for her quick thinking and problem-solving, but instead, she was being blamed for circumstances beyond her control. With all due respect, she began carefully, the vendor delay was unavoidable, but I took immediate action to ensure the project stayed on track. Her calm, logical response seemed to irritate him further. "That's the problem," he said, leaning forward. "You're always reacting, not anticipating. It's clear you're not the right fit for this role." She sat there, stunned. The words "not the right fit" hit her harder than she had expected. It wasn't the first time she had felt the sting of subtle bias in her workplace, but hearing it so plainly was a gut punch. "Sir, my performance reviews have always been positive, and I've consistently delivered on key projects," she said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside her. "I don't understand how you've come to this conclusion." He smirked, an expression that only deepened her discomfort. "You're competent," he said dismissively, "but competence isn't enough. You don't fit the culture here, and I think it's best we part ways." The tension in the room was suffocating. She wanted to argue, to demand a better explanation, but she knew it wouldn't matter. His decision had already been made, and no amount of reasoning would change it. She stood slowly, her posture straight, her expression calm. "If that's your decision," she said, "then I'll respect it. But you might regret this choice." He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "We'll see," he said smugly. As she walked back to her desk to gather her things, the office buzzed with an uneasy energy. A few co-workers glanced her way, their faces a mix of pity and discomfort. No one dared to speak up. In this office, silence was survival. She packed her belongings methodically, her movements calm despite the storm brewing inside her. Her family photo was the last thing she placed in the box, her fingers lingering on the frame for a moment before she straightened up. The boss watched from his office, a satisfied smirk on his face. To him, this was just another day of exercising his authority. He had no idea that his actions were about to have consequences far beyond what he could imagine. The sleek office space, with its glass walls and polished floors, seemed to reflect the tension and exclusivity that defined its culture. But beneath that surface, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that would soon expose the flaws in the very foundation of this workplace. The air in the sleek corporate office felt heavy as the young employee walked back to her desk, her box of personal belongings resting beside her. The whispered murmurs of her co-workers followed her every step, but she didn't let it show on her face. She had just been dismissed by the boss, a man who wielded his authority like a weapon, and now she was left to pack up the remnants of her career here. In the boss's glass-walled office, he watched her with a satisfied smirk, leaning back in his leather chair. To him, this was just another example of his power, an arrogant display of control over someone he deemed unworthy of the position. He didn't feel remorse, only pride in his decision-making. But the look she had given him as she left his office, calm and confident, lingered in his mind. Earlier that day, the tension between the two had come to a head. The morning had started with a minor mishap, a vendor delay on a critical project. Despite the issue being out of her control, she had quickly taken action to mitigate the problem. By coordinating with the vendor and reorganizing the project timeline, she ensured that the impact on the client was minimal. She had barely returned to her desk when her boss's voice rang out from his office. "Get in here," he barked, his tone sharp and commanding. She walked into his office, her professional demeanor intact despite the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He sat behind his large desk, his arms crossed, his expression cold and unreadable. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've created?" he began, his voice laced with condescension. "Mess?" she asked, confused. "The vendor delay was unfortunate, but I've already taken steps to ensure I don't want to hear excuses," he interrupted, leaning forward. "This project reflects on this department, and a delay like this makes us all look incompetent. You should have seen this coming." She took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "With respect, I couldn't have predicted the vendor's delay, but I acted quickly to resolve the issue. The client was satisfied, and the project is back on track." Her calm, logical explanation seemed to irritate him even more. "That's the problem with you," he snapped. "You're always reacting instead of anticipating. If you were truly prepared, this wouldn't have happened in the first place." Her stomach sank at his words. She knew his comments weren't rooted in facts, but in a bias he had carried since the day she was hired. Still, she refused to let him rattle her. "Sir, I've met every deadline, exceeded performance expectations, and maintained positive client relationships," she said steadily. "If there's something specific I can improve, I'm open to feedback, but I believe I've done my job well." He leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming on his face. "You're competent," he said dismissively, "but that's not enough. You don't fit the culture here, and honestly, I've been thinking this for a while. This incident just proves it." The words hit her like a slap in the face, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she held her ground, her tone unwavering. "I'm not sure what you mean by not fitting the culture, sir," she said. "I've consistently delivered results and maintained professionalism in every aspect of my role." His smirk deepened, and he shrugged as if her efforts were irrelevant. "Look, it's not personal," he said, though his tone was anything but empathetic. "It's just clear you're not the right fit for this company. It's better we part ways now." She stared at him, her heart pounding. The injustice of it all was overwhelming, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "If that's your decision," she said calmly, "I'll respect it. But I want you to know that I've given this company nothing less than my best." "Sure," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "but your best just isn't good enough for us." She took a deep breath and stood. "You'll regret this decision," she said softly, her tone calm but firm. His smirk faltered for a moment as her words hung in the air. "We'll see about that," he replied, waving her off dismissively. She walked back to her desk, the tension in the office palpable as her co-workers pretended not to notice what had just happened. She packed her belongings methodically, her movements deliberate and controlled. The framed photo of her family was the last thing she placed in the box. As she looked at it, a small smile tugged at her lips. She knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. From his office, the boss continued to watch her, his smirk returning. He leaned back in his chair, proud of himself for taking decisive action, but her parting words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, a flicker of unease crept into his thoughts. The office buzzed around him, employees working quietly at their desks, careful not to draw his attention. To them, the scene they had witnessed was just another example of their boss's ruthlessness. But what none of them knew, what even the boss didn't know, was that his decision would soon come back to haunt him. The office was unusually quiet the next morning, but the boss, as always, carried himself with an air of arrogance. He strode into the building, nodding curtly at a few employees who avoided his gaze. He felt no need to dwell on the events of the previous day. In his mind, firing the employee had been a necessary decision, a demonstration of his ability to maintain standards. As he settled into his chair and began flipping through emails, his phone rang sharply. He picked it up with his usual impatience. "Yes? Mr. Stevens, the board has requested your presence in the conference room immediately," the assistant on the other end informed him. "The board?" he repeated, frowning slightly. "Did they say why?" "No, sir. Just that it's urgent." The boss hung up and straightened his tie, his smug expression returning. To him, a call from the board likely meant recognition for his decisive actions. Perhaps they were finally going to acknowledge his contributions to the company. With that thought in mind, he grabbed his tablet and confidently made his way to the conference room. When he entered, the mood was far from what he had expected. The large, glass-walled room was filled with the board of directors, all seated at the long table, their expressions serious. At the head of the table sat a man the boss immediately recognized, one of the company's key investors, a man of stature and influence. The boss faltered slightly, his confidence flickering. He hadn't expected this particular individual to be present. The investor, a distinguished black man in his late 50s, exuded calm authority. His tailored suit and composed demeanor commanded respect, but there was an intensity in his gaze that immediately put the boss on edge. "Mr. Stevens," the investor began, his voice steady but firm, "please take a seat." The boss hesitated for a moment before pulling out a chair. As he sat down, he glanced around the room, noting the silence of the other board members. The air was thick with tension, and he suddenly felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The investor leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. "Do you know why you're here?" "No, sir," the boss replied, attempting to keep his voice steady. "I wasn't informed of the reason for this meeting." The investor's gaze didn't waver. "Let me refresh your memory. Yesterday, you fired an employee, a young woman who has been with this company for several years." The boss stiffened but quickly tried to mask his discomfort. "Yes, I did," he said carefully. "Her performance was not up to standard, and she wasn't a good fit for the company's culture." "And what exactly led you to that conclusion?" the investor asked, his tone sharp. The boss hesitated. "Well, there was an issue with a project. A vendor delay caused complications, and she failed to handle it proactively." The boss hesitated. "Well, there was an issue with a project. A vendor delay caused complications, and she failed to handle it proactively. It reflected poorly on our department." The investor raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "From what I've been told, she resolved the issue quickly and ensured that the project stayed on track. Is that not accurate?" The boss's face reddened slightly. "She did, but the delay should never have happened in the first place. It showed a lack of foresight." The investor leaned back, his gaze never leaving the boss. "So, you decided to fire her based on a situation that was beyond her control?" The boss shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I made a judgment call. As department head, it's my responsibility to ensure that our team meets the company's standards." The investor's tone grew colder. "And did you consider her overall contributions to the company? Her performance record? Her dedication to her work?" The boss stammered, struggling to find the right words. I didn't think she was a good fit long-term. It was a decision I believed was best for the department." A heavy silence filled the room as the investor studied him. Finally, he spoke. "That young woman you dismissed is my daughter." The words hit the boss like a punch to the gut. His eyes widened, and his mouth fell open in shock. "Your daughter," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the investor said firmly. "She didn't get this job because of me. She earned it through her skills and hard work, and she has consistently proven herself as an asset to this company. But you chose to ignore all of that and dismissed her without cause." The boss's confidence was completely shattered. He looked around the room, hoping for support, but the other board members remained silent, their expressions unreadable. I didn't know, the boss stammered. If I had known. It shouldn't have mattered who she was, the investor interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Her work should have spoken for itself. But instead, you allowed your biases and assumptions to cloud your judgment. The boss's face turned pale. I didn't mean. I wasn't trying to. The investor cut him off again. Whether you meant to or not, your actions revealed a serious flaw in your leadership. You judged her unfairly, and you made a decision that could have cost this company one of its best employees. The tension in the room was palpable, as the boss sat frozen, unable to defend himself. The power dynamics had shifted completely, and he was now at the mercy of the man he had unknowingly wronged. The investor turned to the other board members. "This incident isn't just about my daughter," he said. "It's about the culture we're fostering in this company. If we allow leaders like Mr. Stevens to act without accountability, we undermine everything we stand for." Several board members nodded in agreement, their expressions serious. The investor turned back to the boss. "There will be consequences for your actions," he said, his tone cold. "You will be placed under review, and your position as department head will be reconsidered. In the meantime, you will undergo mandatory sensitivity training to address the biases that led to this decision." The boss's head hung low, his confidence completely shattered. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, his voice filled with humiliation and regret. As the meeting concluded, the investor gave the boss one final look. "Let this be a lesson, Mr. Stevens," he said. "Your authority doesn't make you untouchable, and your actions, whether intentional or not, have consequences." With that, the investor stood and left the room, leaving the boss to face the silent judgment of the other board members. The boardroom remained silent as the boss slumped in his chair, his confidence and composure entirely gone. The weight of the revelation that the employee he had fired was the daughter of one of the company's key investors bore down on him. The other board members exchanged quiet glances, their disapproval evident. The investor, still standing at the head of the table, broke the silence. "Now that we've addressed the immediate issue, let me share something else that might interest you, Mr. Stevens," he said, his tone sharp and direct. The boss looked up hesitantly, his face pale. "Sir, I didn't know. I wasn't aware." The investor held up a hand to silence him. "Ignorance is not an excuse," he said coldly, "and in this case, it's far worse than you realize. Your decision to fire my daughter wasn't just a poor judgment call, it's part of a pattern." The boss blinked, his confusion evident. "A pattern?" "Yes," the investor replied. "You've been under review for months now. Complaints have been filed by several employees in your department, alleging discriminatory practices, unfair treatment, and a hostile work environment. My daughter's dismissal was the final piece of evidence we needed to confirm what we've suspected all along." The boss's mouth fell open, but no words came out. His mind raced as he tried to recall every interaction, every decision, wondering how much had been documented. One of the board members, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "The board has been conducting an internal investigation into your conduct, Mr. Stevens. We've reviewed employee reports, project performance data, and even observed interactions within your department. The picture that's emerged is not flattering." The boss shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I don't understand. I've always made decisions in the best interest of the company," he stammered. The investor's eyes narrowed. "Have you? Because from what we've seen, your decisions often reflect personal biases rather than objective judgment. You've created an environment where employees feel undervalued and targeted, particularly those who don't fit your narrow definition of culture. The boss's hands trembled slightly as he tried to defend himself. "I never intended to discriminate," he said, his voice cracking. "I was just trying to maintain high standards." "Standards?" the investor repeated, his tone laced with incredulity. Firing a competent, hardworking employee over a situation beyond her control isn't a standard. It's a failure of leadership. And this isn't the first time your actions have raised red flags. The boss's gaze dropped to the table, his humiliation evident. "I didn't know," he mumbled weakly. The investor sighed, his expression softening slightly but remaining firm. "This isn't just about you, Mr. Stevens. It's about the culture we want to build in this company, a culture where talent is recognized, contributions are valued, and everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. Your actions have undermined that mission, and now we have to make things right." He gestured toward the door, and, to the boss's surprise, the young employee he had fired the previous day entered the room. She walked in confidently, her posture straight and her expression calm. Her presence immediately shifted the energy in the room, and the boss's discomfort deepened. The investor turned to his daughter. "Would you like to say something?" She nodded and stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've worked hard to build my career, despite the challenges I've faced as a woman of color in this industry," she began. "When I joined this company, I was determined to prove myself through hard work and dedication, and for years I did just that. But no matter how much effort I put in, it was never enough to overcome the assumptions and biases I faced." She glanced at the boss, her gaze piercing. "Yesterday, when you fired me, it wasn't just about losing a job. It was about realizing that no matter how much I achieved, I could still be dismissed without cause simply because I didn't fit." The boss opened his mouth to respond, but she held up her hand. "I'm not here to argue with you," she said. "I'm here to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Because the problem isn't just about one person. It's about the system that allows these biases to exist unchecked." The room fell silent again, as her words hung in the air. The boss looked down, his face flushed with shame. The investor addressed the board. "This incident has highlighted serious flaws in how we manage our teams and enforce our values. Moving forward, we need to implement changes to ensure accountability and fairness at every level of this organization." He turned to the boss, his tone firm but not unkind. "Mr. Stevens, you will be placed on suspension while we complete this investigation. During this time, you will undergo mandatory training to address the behaviors and biases that led to this situation. Your future with this company will depend on your ability to demonstrate real growth and change." The boss nodded weakly, his voice barely audible. "I understand." The investor's daughter stepped forward once more, her tone softer now. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I experienced," she said. "If this company is willing to learn from its mistakes and create a better environment for everyone, then something good can come out of this." The investor nodded in agreement. "That's exactly what we're going to do. This isn't just about discipline, it's about transformation." As the meeting concluded, the young woman turned to leave, her confidence intact. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, pride evident in his expression. "You've handled this with grace," he said quietly. As the meeting concluded, the young woman turned to leave, her confidence intact. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, pride evident in his expression. "You've handled this with grace," he said quietly. The boss remained seated, his head bowed. The weight of his actions and their consequences pressed heavily on him. He knew he had a long road ahead if he wanted to rebuild his reputation and regain the trust of his colleagues and the board. The meeting room emptied slowly, the weight of the confrontation still lingering in the air. The boss remained seated, his head bowed, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. The investor's sharp words echoed in his ears. "Your actions have consequences." As the door clicked shut behind the last board member, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The realization of how far he had fallen hit him like a ton of bricks. Just yesterday, he had walked into the office with an air of authority, believing himself untouchable. Now, his once proud reputation was in tatters, and his future with the company was uncertain. The news of his suspension spread quickly through the office. Whispers rippled across desks as employees exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to quiet satisfaction. For years, they had endured his condescending attitude and discriminatory practices. Now, seeing him face consequences felt like a long overdue reckoning. "He's finally being held accountable," one employee murmured to another. "About time," the other replied. "Maybe things will actually change around here." Meanwhile, the young employee who had been fired walked through the office one last time, collecting the remainder of her belongings. Despite everything, she held her head high, her calm composure a testament to her strength. As she reached her desk, a few co-workers approached her, their expressions a mix of admiration and regret. "We're so sorry for what you went through," one of them said. "You didn't deserve that." She offered a small smile. "Thank you," she said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through it either." Later that day, she sat in her father's office, reflecting on the events of the past few days. "You handled yourself with grace," her father said, looking at her with pride. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, her voice steady. "But I knew I had to stay calm. If I let my emotions take over, I would have given him exactly what he wanted, a reason to dismiss me as unprofessional." Her father nodded. "You've shown incredible resilience, and because of you, this company is finally being forced to confront its flaws." She smiled faintly. "I just hope they follow through. Change doesn't happen overnight." Over the following weeks, the company began implementing significant reforms. The board introduced mandatory training programs on diversity, equity, and inclusion, ensuring that every employee, from entry-level staff to senior management, understood the importance of fairness and accountability. Hiring practices were overhauled to include blind recruitment processes, reducing the impact of unconscious bias. A new feedback system was introduced, allowing employees to anonymously report issues without fear of retaliation. For the employees who had long felt undervalued and overlooked, these changes were a breath of fresh air. "It finally feels like we're moving in the right direction," one employee said during a team meeting. "It's about time." As for the boss, his suspension served as a humbling experience. During his time away, he was required to attend sensitivity training and sessions on recognizing and addressing bias in the workplace. The stories shared in those sessions opened his eyes to the harm he had caused, not just to the young employee he had fired, but to countless others who had endured his leadership. When he eventually returned to the company, he was no longer the man he had been before. His arrogance had been replaced by humility, and he approached his role with a renewed sense of responsibility. But earning back the trust of his colleagues and employees would take time, a lesson he now understood deeply. For the young employee, the experience marked a turning point in her career. Though the events had been challenging, they also reinforced her belief in the importance of standing up for what's right. She realized that her voice mattered and that her actions could create meaningful change, even in the face of adversity. Reflecting on her journey, she thought about the countless others who had faced similar challenges in their workplaces. "This isn't just about me," she said to her father during one of their conversations. "It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued and respected. If we can achieve that, then everything I went through will have been worth it." Her story resonated far beyond the walls of the company. Employees from other departments and even outside organizations reached out to express their admiration for her courage. "You've inspired so many of us." One message read, "Thank you for standing up and showing us what's possible." Her actions became a catalyst for broader discussions about workplace equity, sparking change not just within the company, but across the industry. In the end, the company emerged stronger from the ordeal. The reforms implemented by the board created a more inclusive environment, where employees felt empowered to speak up and hold leadership accountable. The young employees' resilience and the investors' leadership had set a new standard for fairness and integrity. For the boss, the journey of redemption was ongoing. He knew he couldn't undo the mistakes of his past, but he was determined to learn from them and become a better leader. This story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability and the dangers of prejudice. It highlights the strength it takes to stand up for what's right and the hope that comes from knowing change is possible. In the words of the young employee, "It's not about where we start. It's about where we choose to go from here. And if we can create a future where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, then we've truly made a difference." As the young woman walked out of the office building for the final time, her head held high, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The changes set in motion by her courage and composure were already reshaping the company, proving that standing up for what's right can lead to real transformation. Her story wasn't just about one boss or one employee. It was about the power of challenging injustice and creating a fairer future for everyone. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Have you ever faced injustice at work? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've navigated challenging situations. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to see it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Thank you for watching and being part of a community that values fairness, justice, and change. Stay tuned for our next story, a tale that will inspire, challenge, and remind us all of the importance of standing up for what's right. See you next time.